Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I used to believe 30 was supposed to feel like a doorway, not a wall. A doorway into something solid, stable, adult in a way that felt earned. I had spent my 20s building a life that didn't look like my parents' version of success, but it was 9. I had my own small design studio, a rented loft downtown, a tight circle of friends who felt like chosen family, and a man I thought I might marry one day. I wasn't rich, I wasn't famous, but I was content. And for someone raised in a house where contentment was never enough, that felt revolutionary. My parents never understood my life. They tolerated it. That's different. My father, David, had spent 30 years in corporate finance. My mother, Helen, taught middle school and carried herself like the principal of everyone's moral compass. They valued security, predictability, image. I valued freedom, creativity, flexibility. That difference had been a quiet tension between us for years. It was never explosive, just a steady, humming disapproval. When I sent out invitations for my 30th birthday dinner, I hesitated before adding their names. I almost didn't. But 30 felt symbolic, like maybe this was the moment we all grew up. Maybe this was the year they would finally see that I wasn't drifting, I was choosing. I rented a private room at a little Italian restaurant downtown, candlelight, brick walls, a long wooden table. I kept it intimate, 12 people total. My parents, my younger sister Claire, my boyfriend Mark, my best friend Leela and her husband, 2 close friends from college, and my business partner, Jonah. I remember getting ready that evening in my loft, the light coming in golden through the tall windows. I wore a simple black dress and the necklace my grandmother had given me before she passed. She was the only one in my family who ever told me I was brave instead of reckless. I wanted to feel her with me that night. When I arrived at the restaurant, my parents were already there. That should have been my first clue. They were never early. My father believed in arriving exactly on time, no sooner. But that night, they were seated, stiff-backed, like they were waiting for a meeting to begin. My mother stood when she saw me and gave me a hug that felt rehearsed, polite, controlled. "Happy birthday," she said, smiling too wide. "Thanks, Mom." I brushed it off. Maybe I was imagining things. I went around the room greeting everyone else, hugging, laughing, accepting little wrapped boxes and envelopes. Mark kissed my cheek and whispered, "You look incredible." Leela squeezed my hand and mouthed, "You made it to 30. I felt warm, surrounded, loved. Dinner started beautifully. Wine was poured, toasts were made. Jonah told a ridiculous story about the first client we ever lost because I insisted on using neon branding. Everyone laughed. Even my father smiled, though it looked like it cost him something. Halfway through the main course, my mother tapped her glass with her fork. That sharp little ping cut through the room. I thought she was about to make a toast. I smiled at her, ready to hear something embarrassingly sentimental. Instead, she stood up. "Before we celebrate too much," she began, her voice steady, "your father and I feel it's important to address something." The room shifted. It was subtle, but I felt it. Conversation stilled. Forks paused midair. "Mom," I said lightly, trying to keep it playful, "is this a surprise roast?" "No," my mother said softly. "It's an intervention." The word landed like a slap. I heard someone shift in their chair. I think it was Leela. Mark's hand, which had been resting on my knee, slowly pulled away. "An intervention?" I repeated. "For your life. Your choices, my father clarified. I remember the candles flickering, the smell of garlic and wine, the way my heartbeat suddenly drowned out everything else. This isn't appropriate, I said quietly. We disagree. You're 30 years old, you have no retirement plan, no stable income, you're living in a rented loft like a college student, you're not married, you don't have children, you've tied yourself to a risky business venture that could collapse at any moment. Each sentence felt like a stone placed carefully on my chest. Mom, I whispered, we've spoken to Claire, we've spoken to Mark, even to Jonah. I turned my head so slowly it felt mechanical. Mark wouldn't meet my eyes. Jonah stared at his plate. Leela looked horrified. What did you speak to them about? About our concerns, about your instability, about how enabling your behavior only prolongs the problem. Problem. I was the problem. The room felt smaller, thicker. Claire cleared her throat. We're just worried about you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Scattered. I built a business from scratch, I said, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. I pay my bills. I support myself. You survive. That's not the same as building a future. I looked at Mark then. Did you know about this? He hesitated just for a second. That hesitation told me everything. I thought it might be good to talk things through, he said carefully. In front of everyone? My voice cracked. We all love you, my mother insisted, and love sometimes requires honesty. Honesty? On my birthday? In a public room? Without my consent? My father unfolded the paper in his hand. We've prepared some specific points. Points? Like I was a case study. As he began reading about financial recklessness, about my fear of commitment, about my pattern of defiance disguised as independence, I felt something inside me detach. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was clarity. They hadn't come to celebrate me. They had come to correct me, to fix me, to publicly reshape me into something that made them comfortable. And the worst part wasn't that they did it. It was that 6 of the people at that table had known and said nothing. I sat there, 30 years old, listening to my life reduced to bullet points. And somewhere between lack of long-term planning and questionable romantic priorities, I realized something devastating. This wasn't about concern. This was about control. And for the first time in my life, I understood that if I didn't stand up in that moment, I would be apologizing for existing for the rest of my life. My father's voice kept moving, steady and clinical, like he was presenting quarterly losses. I don't remember every word. I remember phrases. Unsustainable lifestyle, emotional immaturity, pattern of impulsive decisions. Each one slid across the table and lodged somewhere inside me. The worst part was that he spoke as if everyone there had already agreed with him, as if this wasn't a conversation but a verdict being read aloud. I looked around the table slowly. Lila's eyes were glassy with disbelief. Her husband stared at his wine glass like it might offer an escape. Jonah's shoulders were hunched, his jaw tight. Claire wouldn't look at me. And Mark sat very still, hands clasped together, gaze fixed somewhere near the candle in front of him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend me. He didn't say this was a mistake. When my father finally lowered the paper, the silence felt thick and suffocating. My mother placed a hand on his arm like they had just accomplished something noble. We want you to succeed, she said gently. But success requires structure, discipline, stability. and you keep resisting that." I swallowed hard. My mouth felt dry. "You could have called me," I said quietly. "You could have come to my apartment. You could have talked to me privately." "This needed witnesses," my father replied, "so you'd understand the seriousness." Witnesses, not guests, not friends, witnesses. I felt heat rising in my chest, but my voice came out strangely calm. "So you coordinated this?" My mother nodded. "We reached out weeks ago." Weeks. They had been planning my correction while I was planning a celebration. I turned to Jonah first. "You knew?" He exhaled slowly. "They asked to meet for coffee. I thought they just wanted to understand the business." "And you agreed to this?" "They were worried," he said softly, "about cash flow, about you reinvesting profits instead of saving." "That's how growth works," I shot back. "We talked about this." "I know." His voice dropped. "I didn't think they'd do this." But he hadn't warned me, not even a hint. I looked at Claire, my little sister, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "You too?" She finally met my eyes, and there was guilt there, but also something else, something almost resentful. "I'm tired of defending you," she blurted out. "Every holiday, it's the same argument. You roll your eyes at Dad, you dismiss Mom, you act like you're above everything they value." "I don't think I'm above them," I said. "It feels like you do," she whispered. That stung more than the bullet points. Then I turned to Mark, the man who had held my face in his hands 3 nights ago and told me he couldn't wait to build a future with me. "Did you think this was a good idea?" He hesitated again. That pause felt longer this time. "I thought maybe hearing it from all of us would help you slow down." "Slow down from what?" "From constantly chasing the next thing, the next contract, the next rebrand, the next big leap. You're always in motion." "That's who I am," I said. "I know, and it's exhausting." Exhausting. There it was, the first crack in what I thought was solid. "So this is about you being tired?" I asked. "It's about me wanting something steadier, a plan, a timeline. You won't even talk about marriage when you change the subject." I stared at him. "We talked about marriage." "We talked around it," he corrected. The room felt like it was tilting. My birthday had transformed into a tribunal, and now it wasn't just my parents presenting charges. It was everyone. One by one, they were stepping forward with grievances I didn't know they'd been collecting. Lila suddenly pushed her chair back slightly. "This isn't fair," she said firmly. "If you all have issues with her, you address them like adults, not ambush her on her own birthday dinner." My mother stiffened. "We are addressing them like adults." "No, you're humiliating her." Gratitude surged through me so suddenly I almost cried. Someone saw it. "This isn't about humiliation," my father said coolly. "It's about accountability." I laughed then. It came out sharp and brittle. "Accountability for what? Not choosing the life you picked?" "For refusing to secure your future," he replied. "My future is mine," I said, finally feeling the anger burn through the numbness. "You don't get to stage manage it." My mother's voice softened again, the way it did when she thought I was being unreasonable. "We're offering support. If you leave the business and pursue something stable, my father has connections. We could help with a down payment on a house. We could—" "If you leave the business and pursue something stable?" I interrupted. "So this is conditional. Love, help, support, but only if I become who you want." "It's not about control," she insisted. "It feels exactly like control." Mark shifted in his seat. "Maybe they're not entirely wrong," he murmured. That sentence was the final thread snapping. I looked at him fully. "Do you believe I'm a failure?" "No, not a failure." "Then what?" "I believe you're scared to commit to anything permanent." My chest tightened. I committed to you. You keep your exit doors open, always, he replied quietly. That hurt because a part of me recognized it. I did keep doors open. I'd grown up watching my parents' marriage function like a business contract. Stable, yes. Loving? Debatable. I promised myself I'd never feel trapped, so I built a life with options, flexibility, movement, and apparently that made everyone uneasy. But unease didn't justify betrayal. I looked around that table one more time, at the faces I trusted, at the candles still flickering like this was some ordinary celebration, and something inside me settled. Not rage, not panic, decision. You all had weeks, I said calmly, weeks to tell me you were worried, weeks to sit down with me privately. Instead, you coordinated an ambush. No one spoke. You didn't come to understand me. You came to reshape me. That's not true, my mother whispered. It is. And the fact that you needed an audience proves it. I stood up slowly. My legs trembled, but my voice didn't. If your life makes me uncomfortable, you're free to step back from it, but you don't get to hijack my milestones to stage a correction. My father's jaw tightened. Running away from feedback proves our point. I'm not running. I'm leaving my own birthday dinner. The absurdity of that almost made me laugh again. I looked at Mark. You had a choice tonight. His eyes were glossy now. I thought this would help. It helped, just not the way you expected. Then I turned to Claire. I never asked you to defend me. I just asked you to respect me. Tears slid down her cheeks, but I couldn't comfort her, not tonight. I picked up my purse. The necklace from my grandmother rested warm against my skin. I imagined what she would say. Probably something simple. Child, you don't need permission to be yourself. Lila stood up immediately. I'm coming with you. I shook my head gently. Stay. Eat. Let them finish the meeting. My mother called my name as I walked toward the door. I didn't turn around. If I had, I might have crumbled. The hallway outside the private room felt cool and strangely quiet. The restaurant noise resumed like nothing monumental had happened. I walked past couples laughing, waiters carrying plates, people celebrating ordinary Tuesdays. When I stepped outside, the night air hit my face and I finally exhaled fully. 30 years old, and I had just walked out of my own birthday because the people who claimed to love me couldn't celebrate me without conditions. My phone buzzed almost immediately, messages lighting up the screen. Claire, Mark, even my mother. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I stood there under the streetlight, realizing something both devastating and liberating at the same time. If they truly believed I was unstable, immature, reckless, then maybe they never actually knew me at all. And if they never knew me, then maybe I had been shrinking myself in rooms that were never going to fit me anyway. That night wasn't just an intervention. It was a revelation. I didn't cry right away. That surprised me. I've always been the crier in the family, the one who tears up at commercials and wedding speeches and even overly sentimental dog videos. But as I stood under that streetlight outside the restaurant, my face felt dry and almost numb, like my body hadn't decided what emotion to assign to the night yet. Cars passed, laughter drifted faintly from inside. Life continued in an almost insulting way. I pulled my coat tighter around me and started walking, without really deciding where I was going. My heels clicked sharply against the pavement, each step echoing in the quiet like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence I hadn't agreed to write. My phone buzzed again. I finally glanced at it. Mark, please don't shut me out. Claire, I didn't want it to go like that. Mom, come back. We can talk calmly. Dad, you're proving our concerns. That last one made me stop walking. Even now, he was framing my pain as evidence against me. I slipped the phone back into my purse without responding. If I answered now, I would be reacting, and I was tired of reacting. I ended up at the small park 3 blocks from the restaurant. There's a fountain in the center that runs even at night, water spilling gently over stone. I sat on the edge of it, not caring that my dress might wrinkle. The cold stone felt grounding, real, unlike the surreal scene I'd just left. I replayed the evening in my mind, trying to identify the moment it tipped from awkward to irreparable. Was it when my mother said intervention? When my father unfolded that paper? Or when Mark admitted he thought public pressure might help me? I realized it wasn't a single moment. It was the weeks of secrecy, the coordinated silence, the agreement that I needed correction but not consent. The tears finally came then, slow and steady, not dramatic sobs, just quiet grief. I wasn't mourning a ruined birthday. I was mourning the illusion that my family and my partners saw me as an equal adult. They had seen me as a project, a risk to be mitigated. And what hurt most was that part of me had been trying so hard to earn their approval that I hadn't noticed how conditional it was. I thought about my childhood, about report cards and piano recitals and science fairs. My father's praise always came with a caveat. Great job, but next time. My mother's hugs were warm, but often followed by advice. I learned early that love in our house was intertwined with improvement. Be better, be smarter, be safer. I had internalized that as care. Maybe it was, but somewhere along the way, care became control. The fountain water shimmered under the park lights. I traced my finger along the edge of the stone and remembered something my grandmother once told me. I had been 15, crying because I wanted to apply to an art school program in another state, and my parents thought it was impractical. She took my hands and said, "They love you in the only way they know how, but you don't have to live in their comfort zone." I didn't fully understand it then. I think I did now. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Leela. "I'm outside. Where are you?" I hadn't even realized she might have left the restaurant. I looked around and spotted her hurrying across the grass toward me, her heels sinking slightly into the lawn. When she reached me, she didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped her arms around me. And that's when I broke. Not because she said something profound, but because she didn't try to fix me. She didn't list my flaws. She just held me. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into my hair. "That was brutal." "I feel stupid," I admitted, "like I should have seen it coming." "How could you?" she said, pulling back to look at me. "Who stages an intervention at a birthday dinner?" "Apparently my parents." She sat beside me on the fountain edge. "Your dad looked like he was presenting to a board of directors." I let out a shaky laugh. That's exactly what it felt like. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the water. Then she asked gently, "What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air. I hadn't thought that far. Walking out was instinct, survival. But what came next? Did I go home and pretend this was a misunderstanding? Did I apologize for overreacting just to restore peace? That had been my pattern before. Smooth things over, absorb the discomfort, be the flexible one. "I don't think I can just go back to normal," I said finally. "Good," she replied firmly. "You shouldn't." I thought about Mark, about the way he had said I kept exit doors open. Maybe I did, but tonight he had quietly held the door open for my parents to walk through and dismantle me. That felt like a different kind of exit. "Did he say anything after I left?" I asked Leela. "He looks shaken," Leela said. "Your mom tried to frame it as tough love. Your dad said you were being dramatic. Mark didn't argue, he just sat there. That hurt in a dull, persistent way, not explosive, just heavy. "I need space," I murmured. "Then take it," she replied firmly. "You don't owe anyone immediate reconciliation." We stayed at the park for almost an hour. Eventually, the chill in the air seeped through my coat, and I knew I needed to go home. Leela offered to stay with me, but I shook my head. I need to be alone tonight. I need to hear my own thoughts without anyone else narrating them. When I got back to my loft, the silence inside felt different than usual. Not peaceful, charged. I kicked off my heels and stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the exposed brick walls, the large canvases leaning against them, the messy desk covered with sketches. This was the life they called unstable. It didn't look unstable to me. It looked alive. I poured myself a glass of water and sat on the floor, back against the couch. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Mark calling. I let it ring out. A voicemail notification appeared seconds later. I didn't play it. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up my business accounts, revenue charts, client contracts, growth projections. Yes, it fluctuated. Yes, it required risk, but it was real, tangible, built from my ideas and long nights and relentless effort. They had reduced it to recklessness because it didn't fit their template. Around midnight, there was a knock on my door. My heart jumped into my throat. I knew who it was before I even checked. Mark stood in the hallway when I opened it, hands in his pockets, face drawn. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. I hesitated, just for a second, then I stepped aside. He walked in slowly, looking around like he hadn't been there 100 times before. "I'm sorry," he began immediately. "I didn't think it would feel like an attack." "It was an attack," I said quietly. "I thought if we all expressed concern together, it might feel supportive." "In what world?" I asked, not angrily, but genuinely. He ran a hand through his hair. "Your parents reached out. They said they were worried. They asked if I'd noticed the same patterns." "And you said yes?" I said, "I sometimes feel like you're always chasing something bigger, and it scares me." "Because you want small?" I asked. "Because I want certainty," he replied. I looked at him for a long moment. The man I loved, the man who now seemed like a stranger in subtle ways. "And you thought public pressure would make me change?" "I thought it might make you reflect." "I reflect constantly. You just don't like my conclusions." Silence settled between us, heavy, honest. "Are you choosing them over me?" he asked finally. I felt a slow, painful clarity spread through my chest. "No," I said. "I'm choosing me." He closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. And in that quiet living room, still wearing my birthday dress, I realized something that scared me more than the intervention itself. If standing up for myself meant losing him, then maybe he had never been standing beside me in the first place. Mark stayed standing in the middle of my living room, like he wasn't sure whether he was still welcome there. The air between us felt fragile, stretched thin by everything that had been said at the restaurant and everything that hadn't been said for months before that. I had always believed love was about compromise, about finding a middle ground where two people could build something steady together. But suddenly, I was staring at the possibility that compromise in my life had started to look a lot like shrinking. "I'm not your enemy," Mark said quietly. "I know," I replied, "but tonight you stood with people who treated me like I was broken." His jaw tightened. "They're your parents. They love you. Love doesn't get to humiliate me." He exhaled slowly. "They were scared." "Of what? That I won't retire at 55? That I won't buy a house in the suburbs? That I won't follow the exact blueprint they think guarantees safety?" "It's not just about them," he said quietly. "It's about me, too. I crossed my arms, not defensively, but to hold myself steady. Then say it clearly. He hesitated again, but this time he forced the words out. I don't know if I can build a life with someone who refuses to anchor. That word hit me harder than I expected. Anchor, as if I were a boat drifting aimlessly instead of someone deliberately navigating her own course. I am anchored, I said, my voice steady, just not to the things you want. And what do you want? He asked, almost pleading. I want growth. I want flexibility. I want to wake up knowing I built my day with intention, not obligation. I want a partner who sees my ambition as a strength, not a threat. And I want stability, he replied. A house, a plan, kids in the next few years, predictability. There it was. Not cruelty, not malice, just incompatibility, finally spoken out loud. For months, we had danced around these differences. When he talked about mortgage rates, I talked about expanding into a new market. When he mentioned timelines for marriage, I suggested we travel more first. Neither of us had been lying, we just weren't fully aligning. But that doesn't justify what happened tonight, I said softly. He nodded. You're right, it doesn't. We stood there in silence, the weight of that acknowledgement settling between us. I need to know something, I said finally. If my parents hadn't organized that dinner, would you have told me how you felt? He looked down at the floor, and that hesitation again was answer enough. I was waiting, he admitted, for the right time. My birthday wasn't it. I know. The simplicity of that statement hurt more than defensiveness would have. He knew, and he still participated. I walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, smudged mascara, tired eyes, necklace resting against my collarbone like a quiet reminder of who I was before anyone tried to redefine me. I love you, he said behind me. I closed my eyes briefly. I love you too. But love isn't enough if we're trying to steer the same ship in opposite directions. He didn't argue with that. Maybe he couldn't. So what are you saying? He asked slowly. I'm saying I won't redesign my entire life to calm everyone else's anxiety. And I won't pretend I'm okay with the uncertainty, he replied. There it was again, not anger, not betrayal in the traditional sense, just two truths colliding. The room felt unbearably quiet. I realized if I let this stretch any longer, we would both start negotiating from fear instead of clarity. And I didn't want to make decisions from fear anymore. I think we need to end this, I said gently. His face went pale. Tonight? When would be better? I asked softly. After more resentment builds? After one of us forces the other into a version of life we don't want? He ran both hands over his face. I didn't expect this. Neither did I whispered. We had planned a weekend trip next month. We had talked about adopting a dog. We had casually browsed furniture online, imagining a shared space someday. And yet here we were, watching all of that dissolve in the span of a few hours. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I know. But tonight showed me something important. When pressure came from my parents, you aligned with them instead of standing beside me. He swallowed hard. I thought standing with them was standing for us. It wasn't, I said quietly. He stepped closer, as if proximity might change the outcome. Is there any part of you that thinks they had a point? I considered that honestly. There's always room for growth, but growth has to be chosen, not forced in front of an audience. He nodded slowly. We didn't yell, we didn't throw accusations. There was no dramatic storming out, just two people recognizing a truth that had been forming quietly for months. He walked toward the door, then paused. I hope you find what you're looking for. I already have, I said softly. I just need to protect it. After he left, the silence felt heavier than before. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, hugging my knees to my chest. The tears came again, stronger this time, not because I doubted my decision, but because endings, even necessary ones, still hurt. That was one relationship gone, but the night wasn't finished unraveling. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a group message from my parents. Claire was included, Jonah too. My father had written, "We will not apologize for caring. We hope you reflect and reach out when you're ready to make responsible choices." Responsible choices? As if ending my relationship to preserve my integrity wasn't responsible. As if walking out of humiliation wasn't responsible. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed something I never imagined I would send. "I need distance. Please do not contact me for a while." My thumb hovered over the screen. This wasn't just space after a fight. This was boundary setting, something I had avoided for years because I feared it would be interpreted as rebellion. I hit send. Almost immediately, 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. I didn't wait for their reply. I muted the conversation. The loft felt different now, quieter, emptier, but also clearer. I walked to the bathroom, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. 30 years old, single, estranged from my parents, at least temporarily, my sister upset, my boyfriend gone, my birthday reduced to rubble. 6 relationships were teetering on the edge, and yet, beneath the grief, there was something else. Relief. For the first time in my life, I hadn't apologized for existing the way I am. I hadn't twisted myself into a more palatable shape. I chose myself. The cost was higher than I expected, but maybe the cost of continuing to shrink would have been even higher. I turned off the lights and walked back into the living room, the city still glowing beyond the windows. My grandmother's necklace caught the faint light, and I touched it gently. "They love you in the only way they know how," she had said. Maybe that was true, but I was finally learning to love myself in the way I needed, and that was going to change everything. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while fragments of the evening replayed in a loop. My father's measured tone, my mother's soft but unwavering smile, Claire's trembling voice, Mark's careful admissions. It was like my brain was trying to make sense of it by replaying it from different angles, as if maybe there had been a version of events where I misunderstood. But every time I walked through it in my mind, the conclusion was the same. They hadn't asked how I felt. They had presented who I should be. Around 4 in the morning, I got up and made tea. The city outside my windows was quieter at that hour, the usual hum reduced to a soft murmur. I sat at my kitchen counter, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky shift from black to gray. 30 years old, I had imagined waking up the morning after my birthday feeling celebrated, maybe slightly hungover, maybe sentimental. Instead, I felt like I had just stepped out of a courtroom where the verdict had been handed down, and I had chosen not to accept it. When the sun finally rose, exhaustion settled into my bones, but I felt strangely steady, not numb, not frantic, just clear. My phone was filled with messages. Claire had sent 3 long paragraphs. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said she felt caught between me and our parents her whole life. She said she admired my courage, but also resented it because it made her feel small. That line lingered with me. It wasn't an accusation, it was vulnerability. Jonah had written a shorter message. "I'm sorry, I should have warned you. I didn't think they'd go that far." Practical, direct, but still an admission. My mother's message was more complicated. "We understand you're upset. That wasn't our intention. Please know everything we said came from love and concern. Silence from you will only deepen the divide." It read like a guidance counselor drafting a conflict resolution email. My father hadn't written anything new. And Mark, he had sent a final message at 2 in the morning. I never wanted to lose you, but I can't pretend I don't need more security than this life offers. I hope someday you understand. I stared at that one the longest, not because it made me doubt my choice, but because it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to admit. We weren't losing each other over one dinner. We were losing each other over incompatible visions of the future. By mid-morning, my exhaustion turned into a quiet restlessness. I couldn't sit in the apartment all day replaying everything, so I showered, changed into jeans and a sweater, and walked to the studio space Jonah and I shared a few blocks away. The office smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. The walls were covered with mood boards and client sketches. It had always been my sanctuary, a place where ideas felt limitless and risk felt exciting instead of irresponsible. Jonah was already there. He looked up when I walked in, his expression cautious. "Hey, hey." There was an awkward pause, the kind that only happens when something significant has shifted and neither person knows which version of the relationship they're standing in now. "I owe you an apology," he said immediately, standing up. "I should have told you they contacted you." "Yes," I replied calmly, "you should have." He winced but didn't argue. "I thought they just wanted insight into the business. When they mentioned dinner, they framed it as a family conversation." "And you believed them?" "I wanted to," he admitted. "I didn't think they'd ambush you." I leaned against my desk, studying him. Jonah had been my business partner for 4 years. We had survived slow quarters, difficult clients, even a near lawsuit over a branding dispute. I trusted him professionally. Personally, we kept boundaries clear. "Do you think I'm reckless?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. He considered it. "I think you're bold," he said finally. "Sometimes that scares people, especially people who value predictability." That wasn't the question. He met my eyes. "No, I don't think you're reckless." "Then why didn't you defend me?" He sighed. "Because it wasn't my family, and because I didn't want to escalate it." I nodded slowly. "That's fair." "But I regret it," he added quickly. "I should have spoken up." I believed him. His silence hadn't come from judgment. It had come from discomfort, avoidance. Still painful, but different. "I need to know something," I said. "If this business fails one day, will you blame my ambition?" He shook his head immediately. "If it fails, it'll be because we miscalculated, not because you dreamed too big." That answer steadied me more than I expected. "Good," I said quietly, "because I'm not scaling back to make other people comfortable." He gave a small, relieved smile. "I didn't expect you to." We spent the next hour reviewing client deadlines, grounding ourselves in tangible tasks. It felt good, productive, like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been questioned the night before. But even as we worked, I felt the undercurrent of change, not just in my romantic relationship or with my parents, but in the way I was going to move through the world from now on. Boundaries weren't just declarations, they required consistency. Around noon, my phone rang again. Claire. I stared at her name for a long moment before answering. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi." "I'm so sorry," she blurted out. "I should have told you. I didn't want to upset Mom and Dad." "You didn't want to upset them," I repeated gently. "You didn't want to upset them," I repeated gently. "You didn't want to upset them," I repeated gently. "I've always been the peacemaker, you know that." "Yes," I replied gently, "but peacemaking at my expense isn't peace." Silence filled the line. "I envy you," she admitted suddenly. "You don't seem scared to disappoint him." I let out a small, humorless laugh. "I am scared. I just did it anyway." She sniffled. "They think you're going to cut them off." I asked for space. That's different. "They're hurt." "I was humiliated," I replied softly, "in front of people I love." I know, she whispered. I didn't think it would go that far. That's what everyone keeps saying. Another pause. Are we okay? She asked hesitantly. I thought about that carefully. Claire wasn't my parent, she was my sister. She was also navigating the same household expectations I had grown up with, but she had chosen compliance where I had chosen independence. I don't want to lose you, I said honestly, but I need you to respect my choices even if you wouldn't make them. I'm trying, she said. Then don't participate in public corrections of my life, I replied gently. She let out a shaky breath. Okay. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. When I hung up, I realized something important. The night of my birthday had cracked open more than just one relationship. It had exposed fault lines that had been quietly forming for years. Some of those cracks would widen into permanent breaks. Others might be repaired, but differently than before. By the time I left the studio that afternoon, I felt exhausted but steadier. One relationship, Mark, was over. My parents were in limbo. Claire was uncertain but reachable. Jonah had apologized. That was 3 relationships reshaped already. 6 had been shaken, and I was only beginning to understand what rebuilding would look like. As I walked home under the fading afternoon light, I realized something quietly powerful. They tried to stage an intervention to change me, but what they actually did was force me to confront who truly stands beside me when I refuse to be reshaped. And that realization was going to cost more relationships before it was done. The next few days felt like walking through a house after a storm. Everything was still technically standing, but nothing felt settled. Conversations that used to feel effortless now carried an invisible tension, like everyone was choosing their words too carefully or not carefully enough. I moved through my routines, client calls, grocery runs, morning coffee at the cafe downstairs, but underneath it all was a new awareness. I had drawn a line, and lines change dynamics. On the 3rd day after my birthday, my mother showed up at my loft unannounced. I heard the knock and knew instantly who it was. There's a particular rhythm to a parent's knock, confident, expectant. I stood still in the kitchen for a moment, debating whether to answer. Ignoring her would be easier, cleaner, but avoidance had never truly resolved anything in my family. It just postponed the inevitable. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller, just less certain. Her coat was buttoned all the way up, her purse clutched tightly in front of her like armor. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi. Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, glancing around the loft the way she always did, as if assessing it for potential hazards. The exposed pipes, the abstract canvases, the open shelving instead of traditional cabinets. To her, it probably looked temporary, transitional. To me, it felt like a sanctuary. We sat at the small dining table by the window. I didn't offer coffee. Not out of cruelty, but because I didn't want to slip into hostess mode and pretend this was casual. "I didn't sleep well after the dinner," she began. "Neither did I replied. She folded her hands. "We didn't intend to hurt you. I know you didn't intend to, but you did." She nodded slowly. "Your father believes strongly in accountability. I'm not a failing company," I said. Her lips pressed together. "You've always been defensive, and you've always mistaken autonomy for rebellion," I replied gently. That landed. I saw it in her eyes. She looked around the loft again. "We worry about you." "About what specifically?" I asked. "Your future," she said immediately. "You don't have a safety net." "I am my safety net." "That's exactly what scares us," she whispered. There it was. Not control, not even criticism. Fear. You built a life where security meant survival. I built a life where growth means security. She shook her head slightly. Growth is unpredictable. So is everything. Dad's company could collapse tomorrow. The housing market could crash. Illness happens. Stability is an illusion. She flinched at that word. Illusion. We just wanted you to slow down, to think long term. I think long term every day. You just don't recognize my version of long term. She studied me carefully, like she was seeing something unfamiliar. Maybe she was. I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't deflecting with humor. Mark told us he was worried too, she added cautiously. I felt a small, steady ache at the mention of his name. Mark and I ended things. Her eyes widened. Because of the dinner? Because of what the dinner revealed. She looked genuinely shaken. We never meant to cause that. I believe you, but intention doesn't erase impact. Silence settled between us. The city noise drifted faintly through the windows, a siren in the distance, a car horn, life continuing. I feel like I'm losing you, she admitted finally. That was the first honest thing she had said since sitting down. You're not losing me, I replied softly. You're losing control over how I live. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a second I saw not the orchestrator of an intervention, but a mother who genuinely didn't know how to love a child who chose a different path. I don't know how to support something I don't understand, she whispered. You don't have to understand it fully. You just have to respect it. She wiped at her eyes. Your father won't agree. I'm not asking him to agree. I'm asking him to stop trying to correct me. She looked conflicted, torn between loyalty to him and the dawning realization that pushing me harder might push me away permanently. We thought if everyone spoke together, you'd see the pattern. What pattern? That you're always pushing against structure. I leaned back in my chair. Maybe I push against structure that doesn't fit. She sat with that. And maybe, I said gently, you're mistaking my independence for instability because you can't measure it the way you measure a salary or a mortgage. Her gaze softened slightly. I was proud of you when you started the business. I just thought you'd eventually move into something safer. This is something, and it's mine. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. I can't promise your father will apologize, she said after a moment. I'm not waiting for one. Then what do you want? That question mattered. I want you to stop staging corrections. If you have concerns, talk to me privately, like an adult, not like a project. She winced at that word, project. And I need space, I added carefully. Not silence forever, just space to recalibrate without constant evaluation. She inhaled deeply. That's hard for us. I know, I said softly. It's hard for me too. We sat there for a long time without speaking. The tension wasn't gone, but it had shifted. Less combative, more honest. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. I don't want your birthday to be the memory that defines this year. It won't, I said quietly, but it will define a boundary. She nodded once, then stepped into the hallway. After she left, I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. That was another relationship, reshaped but not broken, fragile, in transition. But not all the fractures would mend so gently. Later that evening, I received a message from one of the college friends who had been at the dinner, Evan. We hadn't spoken much during the intervention, but he'd been there, silent. His message was brief. I think your parents were right. Someone needed to say it. I stared at it, stunned by its bluntness. Someone needed to say it. I typed back slowly. You're entitled to your opinion, but if you believe I needed public correction, then maybe you don't actually respect me. He responded almost immediately. I respect you. I just think you're defensive when confronted. There it was again. Defensive. I felt something inside me go very still. I won't argue about my worth. If that's how you see me, I think we should take distance. His reply was colder this time. If you can't handle feedback, that's on you. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked his number. And just like that, another relationship ended. Not dramatically, not explosively, just quietly closed. That made 4. Mark, Evan, the version of my father who thought he could publicly grade me, and the illusion that compliance equals love. 6 relationships had been shaken that night. Now 4 were either broken or permanently altered. And for the first time in my life, instead of scrambling to repair every crack, I was allowing some doors to close. Not because I didn't care, but because caring didn't mean surrendering my autonomy. As I stood by the window that night, watching the city lights flicker below, I felt the weight of it all, and the strange, steady strength underneath. They called it an intervention, but maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe it was the moment I finally intervened on my own behalf. The days that followed felt quieter, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something breaks, where the dust is still settling and you're not sure which pieces are worth picking up. I moved through my routines carefully, almost protectively, as if my energy were something fragile that needed guarding. A week after my birthday, my father called. He hadn't called since the night of the dinner. That silence had been deliberate, I was sure of it. My mother had come to see me. Claire had texted, but my father, he had waited. I let the phone ring twice before answering. Hello? His voice came through steady, measured. We need to talk. I almost smiled at the phrasing. Not can we talk? Not are you free? Just a directive. We need to talk. I'm listening, I said calmly. There was a slight pause, as if he hadn't expected that. You've created a lot of distance over one disagreement, he began. It wasn't a disagreement, it was an ambush. We were trying to help. You were trying to control. His exhale was audible through the phone. You always interpret structure as control. And you always interpret independence as instability, I said. Silence. He cleared his throat. Your mother is worried you're cutting us out. I asked for space. That's not the same thing. You ended your relationship, he added. Claire told us. I felt a small tightening in my chest. That was my decision. Because of what happened? Because it revealed something I needed to see. Another pause, longer this time. I won't apologize for caring about your future, he said firmly. I'm not asking you to apologize for caring. I'm asking you to apologize for humiliating me. The word hung between us. He didn't respond immediately. I could almost see him standing in his office at home, pacing slightly, choosing words like pieces on a chessboard. You're 30, he said finally. At your age, I had a house, a career path, a plan. And I have a business, a growing client base, financial independence, a plan that looks different from yours. It's volatile, he insisted. So was starting your own firm in your 30s, I reminded him. Grandma told me how scared Mom was. He went quiet at that. You took a risk once too, I said softly. You just call mine irresponsible because you don't understand it. That's not fair, he replied, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. What wasn't fair was turning my birthday into a performance review. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I miscalculated the setting, he said finally. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he had ever come to admitting fault. "The setting wasn't the only issue," I said gently. "You involved other people. You framed me as a problem to be solved. We thought group accountability would show you the pattern." "The pattern?" I repeated. "You mean the pattern where I don't choose what you would choose?" His voice sharpened slightly. "The pattern where you resist stability." "I resist confinement," I corrected. That landed harder than I expected it to. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You think we're your enemy," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I think you're scared." That startled him into silence again. "You built your life around minimizing risk. I built mine around maximizing possibility. Both approaches come with trade-offs." "And if your possibility fails?" he asked. "Then I'll adapt. I won't crumble." His next words came slower. "You've always been stubborn. I've always been self-directed." Another long pause. "I didn't intend to humiliate you," he said finally. "I believe you, but you did." There it was again, intention versus impact. He sighed. "Your mother says you've set boundaries." "Yes." "And you expect us to simply accept them?" "I expect you to respect them," I said calmly. The distinction seemed to catch him off guard. "I don't know how to do that without feeling like I'm failing as a father," he admitted. That was the most honest thing he'd said. "You're not failing because I don't follow your blueprint. You'd be failing if you stopped loving me." Silence. Then, unexpectedly, his voice softened. "I do love you. I know. But love includes guidance." "Guidance," I said gently, "requires permission." He didn't argue with that. We stayed on the phone longer than I expected. The conversation didn't end with a dramatic reconciliation. There was no tearful apology, but something had shifted. He wasn't lecturing anymore. He was listening, at least in small increments. When we finally hung up, I felt drained but steadier. That was relationship number 5 altered. My father and I weren't healed, but we were no longer speaking in absolutes. Later that week, another fracture surfaced. Lila invited me to dinner at her house, just the two of us. I almost declined, still emotionally raw from everything, but I knew she had stood by me when others hadn't. That mattered. Her home felt warm and welcoming, the smell of roasted vegetables filling the air. She poured us wine and steadied me across the table. "How are you really?" she asked. "Tired," I admitted, "but clear." She nodded. "You look different." "Different how?" "Stronger," she said, "but also alone." That word stung. "I didn't plan to lose so much in 1 week," I confessed. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Sometimes when you stop bending, the people who relied on you bending fall away." That truth settled heavily in my chest. We talked for hours about fear, about expectations, about how families sometimes confuse obedience with love. And somewhere in that conversation, I realized something subtle but important. Even Lila had once told me I was intimidating, not maliciously, but casually, as if my ambition was something sharp. How often have I made people uncomfortable just by not downsizing myself? I asked aloud. She tilted her head. Probably more often than you realize. And how often have I tried to soften it? Also more often than you realize. That hit. The intervention hadn't just exposed control, it had exposed how frequently I edited myself to keep others at ease. I left her house that night with a bittersweet clarity. 6 relationships shifted that birthday. Mark, ended. Evan, cut off. Jonah, repaired but recalibrated. Claire, fragile but honest. My mother, learning. My father, listening slowly. And me? I was no longer negotiating my worth. The cost had been high, but as I walked home under the quiet glow of streetlights, I realized something profound. The intervention was supposed to shrink me. Instead, it clarified me. And clarity, even when it's lonely, is power. 2 weeks after my birthday, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a full day off. No client emails, no design revisions, no strategy calls. I silenced my phone, left it on the kitchen counter, and walked out of my loft with nothing but my wallet and my thoughts. I didn't even plan where I was going. I just needed space that wasn't filled with other people's expectations. I ended up by the river on the edge of downtown, sitting on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the water. The current moved steadily, unbothered by anyone's opinion of it. It didn't apologize for changing direction when the landscape shifted. It didn't slow down because someone preferred stillness. I realized watching it that I had spent years explaining myself, explaining my career, explaining why I didn't want to rush into marriage, explaining why renting felt smarter than buying right now, explaining why growth mattered more to me than predictability. And explanations over time had turned into defenses. The intervention hadn't come out of nowhere. It had grown quietly from all those conversations where I justified my choices instead of simply standing in them. For the first time, I asked myself a hard question. Had I been subconsciously seeking their approval all along? Even in rebellion, there can be a need to be understood, to be validated, to be told, "You're doing it right." Maybe I had hoped that by 30, my parents would look at my life and finally say, "We see you and we trust you." Instead, they staged a correction. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against my face. I closed my eyes and let the discomfort settle. I wasn't just grieving relationships. I was grieving the fantasy that one day I would become a version of myself that made everyone comfortable. And that fantasy needed to die. That afternoon, I stopped by my grandmother's old neighborhood. She had passed 5 years ago, but sometimes walking those familiar streets grounded me. Her small house had been sold, repainted a different color now, but the oak tree in the front yard still stood tall. I sat on the curb across from it and remembered her laugh, her unapologetic opinions, the way she once told my father, in my presence, "She's not difficult, she's decisive. Learn the difference." I smiled at the memory. She had been the only one in my family who never tried to steer me. She asked questions, she listened, she trusted that I would learn from my own mistakes. And suddenly, I understood something clearly. The intervention had not been about my future. It had been about their fear of losing relevance in my decision-making. When a child grows into an adult who no longer seeks permission, parents can feel displaced, redundant, powerless. That realization didn't excuse what they did, but it made it less personal. By the time I returned home that evening, my phone was full of missed notifications. I scanned them briefly. Claire had sent a picture of her dog wearing a ridiculous sweater. No heavy message attached, just an olive branch in the form of humor. Jonah had emailed about a potential new client, larger than any we'd handled before. A risk, a leap, exactly the kind of thing my parents would label unstable. And my father had sent a short message. "Let's have dinner. Just us. No agenda." I stared at that one for a long time. No agenda. It was subtle, but it was progress. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I poured a glass of water and sat by the window again, the city lights flickering below. 6 relationships had fractured that night. But something else had fractured too. My fear of disappointing people. I had always imagined disappointment as something catastrophic, like a building collapsing. But what I was learning is this: disappointment is survivable. It stings, it shifts dynamics, but it doesn't destroy you unless you let it define you. 3 days later, I agreed to meet my father. We chose a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral territory, no private dining rooms, no audience. He was already seated when I arrived, reading the menu as if it required strategic analysis. When he looked up and saw me, there was no speech prepared in his eyes, just uncertainty. We ordered coffee. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I've been thinking," he began. "That's usually dangerous," I said lightly. A faint smile flickered across his face. It was brief, but real. "I handled your birthday poorly," he said finally. The words were stiff, measured, but they were there. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "I still worry," he continued. "That won't change." "I don't expect it to. Worry is yours, not mine." He nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction. "I realize now," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that I approached you like a subordinate instead of an adult. That surprised me." "That's honest," I said softly. He looked down at his coffee cup. "It's difficult to recalibrate after 30 years of parenting." "I'm not asking you to stop caring. I'm asking you to trust." He met my eyes. "Trust requires evidence." I almost laughed. "I've been supporting myself for years. What more evidence do you need?" "That it's sustainable." "And if it isn't?" "Then you'll struggle." "Yes," I said simply, "and I will survive." He studied me in silence. "You're not afraid of failing," he observed. "I'm afraid not trying," I replied. That seemed to land deeper than anything else I'd said. We didn't solve everything that afternoon. We didn't rewrite decades of patterning. But for the first time, the conversation felt horizontal instead of vertical. Not parent correcting child, just two adults with different risk tolerances. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. "You won't, unless you keep trying to redesign me." He nodded once. As I walked away from that cafe that evening, I realized something profound. 6 relationships had ended or changed instantly that night. But the most important one, the relationship with myself, had solidified. I no longer needed unanimous approval. I no longer feared standing alone. And I no longer mistook control for love. The intervention was meant to wake me up. It did, just not in the way they intended. A month after my birthday, life no longer felt like a house after a storm. It felt like a house mid-renovation. Walls had been knocked down, furniture rearranged, some rooms empty, some brighter. The dust had settled enough for me to see what remained and what no longer belonged. The biggest change was internal. I stopped over-explaining. When clients asked about our pricing, I stated it plainly instead of nervously justifying it. When friends asked why Mark and I broke up, I said we wanted different futures and left it there. When my mother tentatively asked whether I was considering something more stable, I smiled and said, "I'm building stability my way." No defense, no apology, and something interesting happened. People adjusted. Not everyone, but enough. Claire started calling more often, not to analyze my choices, but to talk about hers. She admitted she was thinking about switching jobs, but felt terrified to disappoint our parents. For the first time, she wasn't positioning me as the reckless one. She was asking how I handled the fear. "I don't wait for it to disappear," I told her one night. "I move while it's still there." She was quiet for a moment. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," I said honestly, "but so is pretending." Jonah and I landed the new client. It was risky, high visibility, demanding, exactly the kind of project that could either elevate us or expose us. When I told my parents, I kept it simple. We signed a major contract. I didn't add disclaimers about contingency plans or safety nets. My father paused, then said, "Congratulations." Just that. No warning about volatility, no unsolicited analysis. It felt small to an outsider. To me, it felt monumental. But not every relationship recalibrated so gently. 2 weeks after I blocked Evan, another college friend, Maya reached out. She had been at the dinner too, quiet, observant, saying very little. Her message was careful. "I didn't agree with how your parents handled it, but I do think some of the concerns were valid." Old me would have asked, which concerns, and opened the door to a debate about my life. New me paused. Instead, I responded, "You're allowed to have your perspective. I'm allowed to choose my path." She replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was it. And I understood something quietly powerful. Not every disagreement requires a confrontation. Some relationships naturally thin out when alignment fades. It doesn't have to be explosive to be final. That made 5 relationships clearly altered. Mark was the one that lingered like an echo. We hadn't spoken since the night he left my loft, but sometimes, late at night, I caught myself wondering what would have happened if I'd chosen differently, if I'd agreed to a more structured timeline, if I'd reassured him instead of drawing a line. One evening, my phone buzzed with his name. I stared at it longer than I should have before answering. "Hi," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "Hi. I've been thinking about you," he admitted. "I figured," I said gently. "I don't want us to end because of one disagreement." "It wasn't one disagreement, it was a worldview." He sighed. "I miss you." The honesty in that tugged at something in my chest. "I miss you too," I admitted. Silence stretched between us. "Do you ever think we overreacted?" he asked quietly. I considered that carefully. "No," I said finally. "I think we finally stopped avoiding the truth." Another pause. "I went to dinner with your parents last week," he added quietly. That surprised me. "Why?" "They reached out. They wanted to check in." "And?" "They're worried about you," he repeated. I almost smiled at the familiarity of that phrase. "And what did they tell you?" "That you're strong and stubborn and brilliant, and that I couldn't keep up with the pace you set." That caught me off guard. "Is that what this is about? Keeping up?" "Partly," he admitted. "You don't need reassurance the way I do. You don't look for consensus. You move. And sometimes I felt like I was either chasing you or slowing you down." His words didn't sting the way they might have a month earlier. They felt honest. "I never wanted you to feel that way," I said. "I know, but wanting different rhythms doesn't make either of us wrong." There it was again, not betrayal, not villainy, just mismatch. "I don't regret loving you," he said quietly. "I don't regret loving you either. But I don't think I can live in constant uncertainty. And I can't live in constant containment." The clarity between us was almost peaceful now. "I hope you find someone who loves the pace you move at. I hope you find someone who loves the structure you crave." We stayed on the phone a few minutes longer, not trying to fix anything, just honoring what had been real. When we hung up, I felt sadness, but not doubt. That was relationship number 6, not ended in anger, ended in truth. Later that night, I sat by my window again, watching the city lights shimmer against the dark sky. It struck me how dramatically one dinner had altered the landscape of my life. 6 relationships shifted instantly. Mark ended, Evan gone, Maya distanced, Jonah strengthened but clarified, Claire evolving, my parents learning new boundaries. On paper, it might look like loss, but it didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like filtration. The intervention exposed which connections were rooted in respect and which were rooted in expectation. I thought back to that moment at the restaurant when my father unfolded his list of points. I remember the heat in my chest, the humiliation, the overwhelming sense of being misunderstood. And I realized something quietly triumphant. If I had stayed seated and absorbed it, if I had apologized for not fitting their mold, every relationship would have remained intact, and I would have fractured instead. Instead, I chose rupture externally rather than internally, and that choice changed everything. 30 didn't feel like a doorway anymore. It felt like ownership. Ownership of my ambition, ownership of my boundaries, ownership of the fact that not everyone will understand my version of stability. And that's okay, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to make everyone comfortable with who I am. I was learning to be comfortable with the discomfort that growth creates. And that, more than any house, any marriage timeline, any retirement account, felt like real security. By mid-December, the air had grown colder, and the city wore its winter coat. Frosted windows, fog rising from street grates, people bundled up like living sculptures moving through the gray light. I walk through it alone most mornings, carrying my coffee, letting my thoughts drift as much as the steam rising from the cup. Life had settled into a rhythm I hadn't anticipated, quiet, steady, and filled with self-imposed boundaries that felt more like liberation than restriction. The fallout from my birthday wasn't over, but I had stopped counting the fractures. Counting only made me anxious, made me wonder if every interaction would end in another heartbreak. Instead, I had begun to sift through my relationships with clarity: who added value, who demanded conformity, who simply reflected their own fears back at me, and which connections I wanted to maintain, even if tenuously. Claire called that afternoon. Her voice was lighter than I'd expected, more playful. "I think I finally get it," she said, laughing softly. "You don't operate on fear, and you won't apologize for existing in full volume." "That's a good way to put it," I admitted. "It's taken me 30 years to realize I've been editing myself to avoid someone else's discomfort." "Yeah, and that's exhausting. I can't tell you how many times I've envied your freedom, even while secretly resenting it." We laughed quietly together, a sound of relief more than joy. I realized that part of the healing wasn't just about distance from others, it was about giving them the space to adjust without judgment. I could love Claire without demanding she mirror my choices, and she could admire my independence without feeling obligated to live it herself. That evening, my mother called. It wasn't a long call, and it wasn't perfect. She didn't apologize fully, and she didn't try to explain the intervention, but she listened. She asked about my work, about my schedule, about my mental health, and crucially, she didn't try to correct me. She didn't question my life choices. I realized that for her, that alone was a monumental step. Later, I walked through the city streets, the hum of traffic and chatter around me comforting. I felt the weight of the past month, 6 relationships tested, some broken, some evolved. But I also felt a strange peace. The interventions, the confrontations, the fractures, they had forced me to confront my own boundaries, my own values, and the truth that not every relationship can survive when authenticity is at stake. Mark's absence was still palpable, but the grief was tempered with understanding. I remembered our last conversation, the honesty we shared, the acknowledgement that our love had been genuine but incompatible. That clarity allowed me to grieve him fully without confusion or lingering resentment. Love had existed, but sometimes love isn't enough when life's trajectories diverge. I thought about the other relationships too, the ones with Jonah, Claire, my parents, Evan, and even Maya. Some had tightened, some had loosened, some had ended. I realized that the pain of their absence wasn't a punishment, it was an indicator. The people who couldn't honor my autonomy weren't enemies, they were simply misaligned with my journey. Sitting alone that night in my apartment, I realized the lesson had little to do with birthdays, interventions, or even specific individuals. It had everything to do with boundaries, courage, and self-trust. The night of my birthday wasn't a disaster. It was a turning point, a violent, painful, necessary shaking of my world that revealed what I truly valued, myself. I thought about how I used to define love and respect, by compliance, by avoiding conflict, by shrinking, and how every relationship, every decision had subtly reinforced that habit. The intervention didn't just expose the fragility of my connections, it exposed the fragility of my own self-definition when it was tied to others' approval. I poured another cup of tea and watched the city lights blur through the window. In that quiet, I made a mental promise to myself. I would no longer apologize for my pace, my ambition, my choices, or the volume of my life. I would no longer bend to make anyone more comfortable at my expense. I would engage with others, yes, but always from a place of integrity, never fear. Over the next few days, small tests appeared. A colleague questioned a risk I wanted to take. Claire hesitated before committing to a plan. My mother sent a cautious text asking if I was sure about a business decision. Each time I responded firmly, calmly, with no justification beyond my own certainty. Each time it felt liberating. Each time the distance I maintained reinforced my boundaries. And slowly, I realized that my relationships, though fewer in some ways, were now truer, less performative, less filtered. I wasn't constantly negotiating for approval or validation. People either aligned with my values or they didn't, and that was okay. Authentic connection mattered more than convenience or comfort. By the end of the month, I looked around my apartment and felt a sense of ownership I hadn't felt before. My life wasn't perfect. There were still fractures, there were still relationships in flux, there was still uncertainty. But for the first time, I felt rooted in myself. I could navigate the chaos without losing my center. I could love others without losing myself. And in that quiet clarity, I understood the gift hidden in the chaos. My parents' intervention seemed cruel at first, but it had catalyzed a transformation I didn't know I needed. It had revealed the relationships that truly mattered and illuminated the ones that had been holding me back. It had forced me to confront the hardest truth, that standing in my own power sometimes means standing alone. I sipped my tea and smiled faintly. I didn't need everyone to understand me. I didn't need everyone to approve. I just needed to honor myself, and in doing so, I was finally free. The weeks after my birthday unfolded like a slow, deliberate awakening. I began to notice small shifts in myself, how I carried my body, how I spoke in meetings, how I responded to texts. There was a steadiness I had never possessed before, a quiet confidence that wasn't flashy or loud, but undeniable. I was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to take up space, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for it. One morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table, journaling, a habit I'd picked up during that chaotic month, when Claire called. She sounded lighter, more relaxed. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," she said, "about you, about your choices. I realized I've been scared to take risks because I've been measuring everything against you instead of myself." I smiled. "That's a start." "It's more than a start," she said. "I think I'm finally willing to step into my own version of adulthood instead of trying to mirror yours or mom and dad's." We talked for a long time, sharing our fears, our hopes, and our small victories. And for the first time, I realized that the ripple effects of my birthday intervention were not only shaping my own life, they were inspiring others to examine their own. My decision to stand firm in my autonomy was teaching my sister, my friends, and even parts of my family a quiet lesson in self-respect. Later that day, I received a text from my father. Simple, direct. Coffee? Just us. No lectures, no interventions. I paused. I thought about the months of tension, the arguments, the words said and unsaid. But there was also the clarity, the knowledge that I could engage with him on my terms. I replied, "Okay, tomorrow morning." The next day, we met at a small cafe near my loft. He arrived first, sitting at a corner table, stirring his coffee slowly. When I approached, he stood and offered a small, tentative smile. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied. We didn't dive into the past immediately. Instead, we talked about mundane things, the traffic, the weather, a mutual acquaintance who had just changed jobs. It felt ordinary, normal, safe, and that ordinariness was a relief. Finally, he leaned back and said, "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversations." "So have I said. He realized now that trying to correct you publicly was wrong, he admitted. It wasn't guidance, it was control disguised as concern. I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my chest. "Thank you for saying that." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I still worry about you. That's not going to change. But I'm learning that worry doesn't give me the right to dictate your life." "That's all I needed to hear," I said. For the first time in years, we laughed together, not awkwardly, not out of politeness, but genuinely. The distance that had existed between us wasn't erased, but it had softened. We could talk, we could disagree, we could even love each other without the need to control or justify. After our coffee, I walked home feeling lighter. The city felt different that day, brighter, somehow expansive. I realized that my birthday intervention, which had seemed like the worst day of my life at the time, had been a catalyst. It had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, to make painful choices, and to reevaluate every relationship in my life. I spent the next weeks reconnecting where I felt safe and necessary, and stepping back where I knew the space was healthier. Mark's absence was still present, a quiet ache in my chest, but I no longer obsessed over what could have been. Love, I realized, isn't always about holding on. It's also about knowing when to let go gracefully. Jonah and I continued building our business. The new client we had secured became a milestone, a testament to risk-taking and trust in ourselves. Claire and I grew closer, not because we mirrored each other perfectly, but because we respected each other's journeys. My mother began sending small notes of support, never overbearing, never intrusive, and my father started attending my art shows and client presentations with quiet pride rather than anxious scrutiny. Even Evan and Maya, the friends who had drifted away, eventually respected my boundaries. Some returned to my life in different forms, some remained distant, but the important thing was that I no longer felt obligated to force connection where it didn't naturally belong. By the time my next birthday approached, I felt a serenity I'd never known at 30. I understood now that milestones weren't about approval or parties or perfection. They were about reflection, growth, and the courage to stand fully in your own life. I spent that day quietly, surrounded by a few friends who had supported me through the chaos, a handful of family members who had shown patience and humility, and the deep, comforting presence of my own choices. I didn't need validation. I didn't need applause. I only needed the quiet confirmation that I was living honestly and courageously. That night, as I looked out over the city from my apartment window, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The intervention had been a fracture, yes, but it had also been a revelation. It taught me the value of boundaries, the importance of self-trust, and the power of authenticity. 6 relationships have been tested that night. Some ended, some evolved, some were repaired, but the most important relationship, the one with myself, was strengthened irreversibly. I realized that the lesson wasn't about punishing anyone or demanding apologies. It was about clarity, courage, and choosing self-respect over comfort. Life would continue to present challenges, people would continue to misunderstand, and conflicts would inevitably arise. But I knew now that I could face them without losing myself. And as I turned away from the window and settled into bed, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. A quiet, deep knowing that even in the chaos, even in the heartbreak, I had chosen me. I had survived. I had grown, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and unapologetically me. The birthday that it felt like the worst day of my life, in reality, had been the beginning of everything.